For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. First of all, I just want to make sure you're in the right place, post-traumatic growth. We're just very fortunate to have Larry Pruitt with us. Just again, Keith Meyer, if you need something, Director of Counseling Wellness, want to touch base, feel free to grab me anytime. So this also gives me a chance to rave about our presenters. Larry, this is a training that is just highly requested, so it's an awesome training that he does. It's really neat. The possibility of transformation in the aftermath of suffering and pain is just a wonderful thing. So Larry donates his time, talent to help us out of the kindness of his heart, and he's also just an incredible partner with the VA and the suicide prevention programs that we have at the WDVA as well. So without any further ado, I just want to introduce you to Dr. Larry Pruitt. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. So, and you guys are going to love the training. All right, thank you. For you, and I'll get out of your way.
Thanks, Keith.
Absolutely.
Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Is this one on? Okay. Well, good morning again. My name is Larry Pruitt. I'm a psychologist at the VA. I work for VA Puget Sound, which is Tacoma and Seattle, sort of on the western side of the state. And I have the good fortune of running our suicide prevention program. And so you might be thinking, well, we're here today to talk about post-traumatic stress. Why do you have a suicide prevention guy doing this? This goes back to work I did before stepping into my role in the VA. And so it's near and dear to my heart. I hope it's useful for you. I will say, if you saw this talk last year, this is a repeat, I guess, by demand. So feel free to attend another breakout if you want, because you saw this one last year. But if this is your first time, thank you for being here today, and I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Okay, so to talk about post-traumatic growth, we have to talk about trauma and PTSD first, okay? And there's another talk about defining what it means to be a veteran. And you can think about kind of trauma the same way. There are multiple ways to define that. Different groups make good efforts at trying to do that. At the end of the day, it's oftentimes a very personal thing. But I wanted to give you some examples here to start. So in DSM-4, back prior to the current diagnostic manual that we have now in the mental health field, we had this really elaborate definition of trauma, right? You had to experience, witness, or be confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or of others, and the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, and horror. That's a high bar. That's difficult to meet, okay? And it really is the extreme conditions that humans endure that allows for that to be achieved. And it's not helpful when it's so hard to get there in terms of being able to provide treatment and conceptualize the suffering that an individual might be engaged in. So fast forward to DSM-5, the current sort of diagnostic manual, and we have a much simpler definition, right? Trauma requires actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Okay. These things happen, they impact people. We have treatments that work, and now we have a definition that allows us to apply those treatments more broadly. But that's not the only definition. We also have APA's definition here, the American Psychological Association, right? Which takes out some of the extremeness of those experiences. So they define it as any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, or other aspects of functioning. So as we go through and we talk about what it means to grow after a trauma, or what it means to experience something like moral injury or post-traumatic stress, remember that the definitions aren't always clear, that things change over time, and that only through sort of looking at these through the lens of the individual are we going to really know the impact that these events have. That being said, when we're talking about traumatic events, this is kind of the list of events that we're talking about, okay? And completely, I don't know, I guess by happenstance, these kind of go from least to most likely to result in PTSD or post-traumatic stress, okay? So starting with natural disasters and ending with sexual assault and combat as the most likely to produce that response. And I will say this is a non-inclusive list. This is not everything, right? These are the big ones, but there's a lot of other things that fall into this bucket as well. So how do we respond after a traumatic event, regardless of how you define trauma, right? Well, we can expect, characteristically for most people, that in the immediate wake of a trauma, you're gonna experience some pretty characteristic things. Hyperarousal, right? You're going to experience like your body is sort of out of control, right? Maybe you are on edge constantly, your heart is racing, you can't sleep, right? Those sorts of things. Re-experiencing, thinking about, dreaming about, having nightmares about the event that happened and how it affected your life. Avoidance behavior, right? Purposefully or not purposefully, trying to distance yourself from the things that you feel contributed or led to that experience in the first place. And emotional experiences that are predominated by fear, anxiety, and anger. Fear being a primary emotion, right? Something that if you look across the world, regardless of culture, everyone experiences fear the same. They make the same facial expressions. They talk about it the same way. To anxiety and anger, which are secondary emotions, where you have the cultural sort of factors come into play in how we define those things, how we talk about, and how we experience those things. And then shifts in our worldview or perspective towards the world around us being both uncontrollable and unpredictable. And if you're going throughout your day-to-day life in a world that is uncontrollable and unpredictable, you're constantly on alert for danger. Because you don't know when you're safe versus when you're not. Okay. For most people, these symptoms resolve over time. Right? We use the 1 month mark as sort of a key indicator for how somebody's doing. It's a lot like a physical wound from an experience, where it will heal over time, but it's gonna hurt at first, and it's gonna get better slowly. And for some people, it resolves, and for other people, it doesn't. Okay? And it's only by waiting that out, giving it a chance to heal, are you gonna know what that long-term outcome looks like. When we talk about PTSD, we often talk about schemas, right? The mental or neurological map of associations that we make between our environment and our experiences. And so this is a typical fear schema, and this is one that gets used all the time. It was originally developed back in the 90s by Edna Fowell when she was conceptualizing treatments for PTSD. And this is a fear schema associated with a sexual assault, okay? And you can see that there are links between things that are independent, some that get related because of that traumatic experience. When this becomes PTSD, you see this happen, okay? All sorts of links get developed that weren't there or prior to the event weren't associated, and now all of a sudden are. And so things that might have been innocuous, like a bald guy, become problematic. They trigger reminders of events, right? In any other place, it might be unremarkable, but for that individual, it becomes particularly salient. Pay attention to these boxes at the bottom, okay? Those are the meaning elements, okay? The way in which we view the world as dangerous, ourselves as incompetent, or as confused, or weak, or whatever label you want to put on that, okay? And you can see how related those become to almost all other parts of the model. That's going to be really important as we start talking about post-traumatic growth. So there are many paths that an individual might experience after a traumatic event occurs. Okay, there's been a lot of talks already about post-traumatic stress, moral injury. We're talking about post-traumatic growth today, but I want to revisit some of these because it would be a disservice to leave you thinking there's only one course that an individual may experience after a traumatic event occurs, okay? Just like if we were to take two people in this room and they were to experience the same experience, the same car accident, the same natural disaster, the same military deployment, whatever it might be, and we asked them after, what do you remember? What was your experience? And what do you make of that experience? You're going to get two different stories, even to the point where they may remember details of the experience differently. Even if you did it with twins, right? Where they have the same environment growing up, they have the same DNA, but their experience of that specific event is different enough to cause them to interpret it in a different way. And this has been done in scientific research. And we know that the lens that we receive information changes based on our history of interaction. So that twin number one, who had that different life experience growing up, is going to view that traumatic event differently than twin number two, who maybe had a different set of experiences, despite the DNA being the same, despite the environment that they were raised in being the same. And so our experience of trauma is going to be individual. And that's tough, because if we're talking with somebody who went through something that we see as similar, or maybe not even as bad as things that we've been through, we might say, why are you having such a strong reaction to that? But it's up to that individual to define how they react to that trauma. There's no right or wrong way to heal, but there are some broad categories that we can talk about that are useful in sort of putting folks onto a trajectory about what needs they may have going forward. One caveat that I will repeat several times during the presentation is that these are not static trajectories where once you're on it, you're going to end up at the end point, okay? People move between and across these things constantly. You might have several months where you are experiencing PTSD, and all of a sudden something shifts and you are experiencing post-traumatic growth, and then you shift back because something triggered you. Or you might be experiencing acute stress, and all of a sudden natural recovery kicks in and you no longer have those experiences, right? At some point in your future, maybe after years, you retire and all of a sudden you have all this mental space to think, and you're right back there where you were with the traumatic event. These things shift and change, and folks move between them, and there's no single path that you can count on somebody being on. So the first path that we're going to talk about is natural recovery. Okay, this is one that's often overlooked. It's probably the one that's talked about the least, yet is the most common, or what we call the modal response to trauma, which is you get back to who you were before. Okay, not exactly, but pretty darn close. Okay, you have that 1 month period where you are, like everybody else, struggling with all sorts of difficulties, and at some point that remits. Just like a physical wound, our bodies are amazingly resilient and heal themselves, and this is what happens for most people. Now, it doesn't mean that you completely recover, right? We'll put up another schema here in a second to show this. But the long-term trajectory here really does evidence signs of sort of a return to baseline, right? And so take a look at this, and this is sort of what the schema looks like after natural recovery. You'll see that those median elements are still there, they're still associated with things, but not nearly as much or as extensively as they were before. So the individual may still identify some things as dangerous, like being alone, which may or may not be, but they're not associating it with every situation or every sort of stimuli that they experience. Acute stress disorder, okay? This goes back to DSM-4. Acute stress disorder was defined in 1994 and kept in 2013 with DSM-5. And this is really to show that for some folks, that first month is particularly bad, right? That if you have more than a certain threshold of symptoms, 9 of the 14 that we say are related to PTSD, minus the time criteria, that you probably are experiencing things more so than you would expect. And when that occurs, we call it acute stress disorder. Is that particularly meaningful? Maybe, maybe not, but what it does is it allows us to give a justification for folks accessing healthcare and treatment for the symptoms that may eventually become PTSD early on, before things fester and become problematic, okay? So you think of a natural disaster. This is a picture of some recent flooding that occurred on the East Coast, and it's gonna be completely understandable that somebody in that first month after is experiencing, right, thoughts of, why did this occur? What could I have done differently? Right? Why did this happen to me? I'm waking up at night thinking about this. All of those things that are, you know, oftentimes so familiar. Post-traumatic stress is going to be the next path that we talk about. You'll notice that this isn't post-traumatic stress disorder. This is just post-traumatic stress. And this is where you don't need to meet that criterion A, traumatic experience. You define what the trauma is, okay? But you might be experiencing all of the other symptoms that could become PTSD. So reliving the event, right? Memories coming back, feeling like those memories are real, scary, and threatening. Avoiding things that remind you of the event, people, places, situations, because they bring back those negative emotions. Having more negative thoughts and feelings than before the event. Changes to the way you think or perceive or interpret information from your environment. And then feeling on edge or keyed up all the time, right? That's a hyperarousal criteria. Being jittery, always on edge, looking out for danger, suddenly angry or irritable because you're dedicating so much mental resource to scanning for threats. And in post-traumatic stress, these symptoms can extend for long periods of time, but they remain at a subclinical level, right? They're not meeting the number or the frequency needed to say, hey, this is now moving into the territory of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's lots of things that can produce post-traumatic stress for folks, and lots of ways that folks recover from it. Now, let's differentiate that from true post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? With post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have that criterion A event that meets those definitions that we talked about at the very beginning. You have to have at least one or more of the re-experiencing symptoms, which you can see here. You have to be actively avoiding things that remind you of the traumatic event. Okay, you can see what those are listed here. You have to have 2 or more symptoms associated with having more negative thoughts or feelings than you did before the event. That's a new one with DSM-5. And then 2 or more symptoms of feeling on edge or keyed up or hyperaroused. Okay. Those symptoms have to last at least a month. Again, we're not going to be too concerned in that first month because everybody is going to be experiencing those things. But if it lasts more than a month, if it causes you to be unable to carry out the things that you need to do in your life, okay, that becomes an important piece that has to get met. And we can't say that these are due to a medical condition or substance that you're using or anything like that. Okay, that's PTSD. Now, PTSD that's used a lot, oftentimes without sort of the rigor of these diagnostic criteria, so we want to be careful in how we're thinking and talking about this and using the language. This is a very specific behavioral health condition that warrants specific behavioral health interventions. And our military service members and veterans are sort of a prime example of what it is to experience the development of post-traumatic stress and to live with that for years. Anybody know what the mean amount of time, the average amount of time between a traumatic experience and when somebody starts seeking treatment for that is? Sorry?
10 years.
10 years? Close, 12. 12 years. Okay, 12 years of suffering, 12 years of trying to find a way through this and it not working. Okay. Now there are 2 other trajectories, and this is kind of why you're here, that we're going to talk about. Okay, moral injury. We're just going to spend a little bit of time on that because it deserves its own, hour and a half presentation itself. And then where we're going to spend the rest of our time, which is talking about post-traumatic growth. Okay. Moral injury. Who's heard this term or is familiar with this term? Okay, good. That's a change, right? We haven't talked about this a lot as a path for folks. Moral injury is really take all that stuff we just talked about in terms of traumatic experiences and add to that sort of this component of I did something that violated my own morals and beliefs, or I didn't do something that was consistent with my morals and beliefs and people suffered as a result of that, or I was betrayed by those I trusted and I don't know how to make sense of that information going forward. Okay. Whereas PTSD is defined by fear and anxiety, moral injury is defined by anger, shame, guilt, and disgust. It is a different and oftentimes additional beast that folks have to live with. Okay. Again, this has all sorts of implications for folks. We could spend a whole Serving Those Who Serve conference just talking about moral injury and the impacts that it has and how to resolve that with folks. Okay. But please just know that this is one of those paths and that it leads to things like complex PTSD, which was a talk earlier yesterday. It leads to treatments that otherwise would be effective, maybe not working so great, and we really need to attend to it. Okay, good example of this came from the early days of the COVID pandemic, when healthcare staff had to make judgment calls about whether family members could be with their loved ones who were dying. Okay, and having to transgress on those values as a healthcare provider for safety reasons was difficult for a lot of people, and it led to a lot of moral injury within healthcare. And so when we talk about sort of the crisis for healthcare providers during the pandemic, yes, it was long hours, yes, it was, putting yourselves at risk, but it was also a lot of moral injury that was happening. Okay, that brings us to post-traumatic growth. Okay, who's heard of this term before? Good. All right, post-traumatic growth is one of the most unique and probably rarest opportunities that follows trauma, right? It is a positive psychological change that comes after somebody experiences a life-altering traumatic event. It doesn't mean that you aren't extremely distressed, traumatized, changed by that traumatic event. That can be 100% true, and there can be some change to those meaning elements that we talked about in the schema that allow you to grow as a result of that event, to make something positive, to shift your world perspective in a way that allows something really unique and beneficial to happen. Okay, so post-traumatic growth can and does coexist with PTSD. I don't want folks thinking it's one or the other. For most, it's going to be both. Okay. Tedeschi and Calhoun, who we will look at some of their research here in a minute, really are the pioneers of this concept. And there's a quote here I'd like to share that really kind of speaks to this point. So they say that people with post-traumatic growth develop new understandings of themselves and the world they live in and how to relate to other people, the kind of future that they might have, and a better understanding of how to live life. Okay, when we're talking about post-traumatic growth, that's what we're talking about. Again, it's sort of a spectrum, right? Some are going to experience that in an extreme way. Most are going to be somewhere in the middle, and some not at all. I don't know if this is a real thing. I've never been to Japan to verify this, but it's real?
It's real.
Okay, good. I was hoping somebody might validate for that. But the concept, I think, speaks to what we're talking about here, which is to repair things with gold, right? The art of repairing pottery, in this case, with gold or silver lacquer, with an understanding, and this is the important piece, an understanding that piece of pottery is more valuable for having been broken in the first place. Okay. I oftentimes get asked, like, what's the secret, right? How do we make this happen? What's the magic trick? And there is none, right? That's the thing with mental health. There's no magic cures. But when I get asked that, I often reflect back on my training. And if anybody's familiar with Steve Hayes and acceptance and commitment therapy, okay, Steve probably had the closest thing that I would say to sort of that magic piece of understanding, which is that we all try to work to not be broken, but the fact of the matter is we're all broken in some way. And it's what we do with that after we're broken that becomes important, okay? It's not avoiding it in the first place, it's accepting it, and then taking that next step and the next step after that. These are some examples of how that's happened in the world of traumatic stress, okay? Anybody is Luz still in the room? She's not. Anybody in the mask presentation yesterday? Right? That was a project funded by the National Intrepid Center for Health, the Brain Injury Program, and it's extremely powerful, and it's given those veterans an opportunity to grow as a result of their trauma through art and expression, okay? Anybody heard of Creative Vets? All right, go look them up, okay? They are a songwriting and music-based program for veterans, by veterans. They're based out of Tennessee. They pair veterans with major artists to do songwriting workshops. Chris Stapleton is a great example of some of these things. And then they work with those veterans to get that music out into the public to help other vets.
Is that Scotty Hastings? Is he part of the Creative Vets?
I'm not sure, possibly. If you go on YouTube and you look up Creative Vets, you're going to see all sorts of great songs and music videos that have come together that are going to be particularly relevant to the veteran community and speak to this healing journey that's happened for a lot of these folks. Bring your tissues because it will hit you close to home. Okay. Yeah, an example here is one of the songs, Bolts and Angels. But there's many others, and they're incredibly powerful. One from the civilian world I like to talk about is Elizabeth Smart. Folks will remember her sort of trauma and being sort of kidnapped as a child. She's now producing movies and documentaries for other kidnapping survivors to tell their story, to promote awareness about this. And if you don't think that is activating of her trauma in some way, or difficult work for her to do, you're probably in the wrong room, right? It is, yet she does it because it's important and it's impactful, and it has led to, and she's talked a lot about this, growth within herself, about what those experiences have meant to her. Now, those are all outliers, right? These are folks on the extreme end of the spectrum. Not everybody who experiences post-traumatic growth is going to do those huge, amazing things that get talked about by other people. It may be the little stuff, though, that's really important, okay? Most people who experience post-traumatic growth are going to experience more of the ordinary but meaningful changes, right? We heard some of this in the keynote this morning. Relationships with a spouse, relationships with a family member, connecting to helping others, right? Probably a lot of the nonprofits that you have tables in the lobby, if you dig into why they're doing that work, it's because of trauma, right? And they've taken that trauma and said, hey, we're going to do something meaningful about this. So there are kind of these 5 areas that we talk about being really important to post-traumatic growth, and that we're going to, as we try to think of how do we foster post-traumatic growth, we're going to focus on, right? Identifying new possibilities, increasing personal strength, enhancing relationships, appreciation for life, and spiritual or religious growth. Okay, those are sort of, when you look at the big factors involved, those are the 5. But before we do that, you should all be asking yourself at this point, is this real, right? We're talking about folks defining something, putting words to it, but at the end of the day, it's sort of an individual's experience. Is this a real thing? We don't know, okay? When we look at the research into post-traumatic growth, we're kind of still in the infancy of that. We haven't done a lot of the work that needs to be done. It's an ongoing process, okay? One argument is that maybe it's just normal resilience that's been taken to an extreme, right? And so is it really different, or is it just more of that sort of natural recovery process that we talked about earlier? Many studies have relied on self-report, right? So asking an individual, hey, what has this been like for you? And sometimes that self-report, which is used to identify post-traumatic growth, doesn't really match the objective indicators for what we would expect for post-traumatic growth. So we say, hey, this has really enhanced my relationship with my partner. But if other folks were to rate sort of that relationship, would they say the same thing? Maybe, maybe not, okay? And so there's some mixed findings there. And one of the biggest kind of arguments against post-traumatic growth is the idea that maybe this is just another way, a overly relied upon but temporary strategy for managing one's emotions in the wake of trauma to get you through those really difficult moments while you're waiting to recover or heal in some way. And couldn't this just be another coping mechanism? Possibly. Okay, again, we don't know yet, we don't have the data for that. But it's also like, that's a good problem to have if that's the case, right? Yeah.
Can I ask you to speak just a little bit louder?
Sure.
Thank you.
Move this closer. How's that?
Oh, that's better.
Okay. You just gotta tell me the sooner. Just gonna keep prattling on. Okay. So regardless of sort of whether this becomes sort of something that's valid in the mental health literature or not, colloquially, day to day for an individual's life, this has been something that's been going on for a really, really long time. Traumatic events and the experience of trauma are, unfortunately, part of the human experience, okay? And they will likely always occur. And because of biological and psychological and social factors, some folks who experience those events will go on to develop PTSD. And some folks will go on to develop moral injury, and others will go on to develop post-traumatic growth, okay? It's a recovery process. It's not something that can really be done ahead of time, right? The trauma has to happen, and then certain things occur that allow that person to access that recovery path rather than one of those other paths. And the reason it's called post-traumatic growth is because that term, growth, communicates that it's a journey, okay? That this is something that folks move towards, maybe never reaching completely. Sometimes you deviate from that path, sometimes you find it again, but that it's an ongoing process, okay? So just going back to the history, anybody know the two sort of epic poems that are attributed to Homer? The Iliad and the Odyssey. That's absolutely right. And the Iliad is a story of war, right? Yeah, one's experience in a horrific set of battles for the city of Troy. The Odyssey is one of those characters' return home, right? Odysseus. And the struggles and the paths that sometimes took him on pretty horrendous routes, and the challenges that he faced and overcame just to arrive back at his home. And it's the story of growth, because he didn't arrive home the same person that left that home. He arrived home a very different person, and not in a good way. And sorry if this is, I need to say spoiler alert here. Several thousand years, you should have read it back. He returns home in a not very good way, and he recovers. He gets his life back through a lot of work that happens once he arrives back home.
Wasn't it 12 years? 12 years it took him to get back.
Yeah, something like that. It was a long time. Okay, so a little bit more on the modern era, right? Bringing us back to the present day. So, as I mentioned before, Tedeschi and Calhoun were really the pioneers of identifying and defining what post-traumatic growth was. And as we talked about earlier, there are some key steps that I missed one here apparently. There are 5 that we're going to talk about. But going back to the examples I showed, you can see these occurring with those specific programs, right? So survivors of trauma recognizing and embracing new opportunities. Well, that's like that Creative Eds program. These are folks who probably never thought of being a songwriter or musical performer beforehand. But because of the impact that that trauma had on their life, they were looking for an opportunity to heal, and they found that through music, right? And they could have shut that door right away and said, that's not my thing. But they opened themselves up to it knowing that they were going to stumble and have to work at it. They weren't musicians often, before this, or maybe they played a little guitar or whatever, but now they are doing these really amazing things because of that openness to opportunity, okay? Forging stronger relationships with loved ones as well as victims who suffered in the same way, right? Think of Elizabeth Spark. She's now sharing sort of her experience to others who have gone through this and making that more aware, like building awareness in the community at large, right? It's a change in relationships. Cultivating inner strength through knowledge that they can overcome a tremendous hardship. If you were in that masks talk yesterday and you heard the artist statements, what did that tell you? I mean, they all spoke about sort of the growth that they found from their trauma, right? And then gaining a deeper appreciation for life and their relationship to religion and spirituality. There's no right version of what that spirituality or connection to a higher power looks like. That's completely up to the individual, but it's some connection to something bigger than themselves, right? That's really what we're talking about here. So why does this happen? Why do some folks end up on this path and not others? Well, if we think back to trauma as the initiating event, we know that at a minimum, trauma shakes, but more often shatters our pre-existing beliefs about the world, what it means, what concepts like safety means, what our comfort level with unpredictability or control means in the world around us. And when that's broken apart or shattered, right, you have to sort of redefine your place in this world and what it means to walk out on that dark street or connect with that person you don't know or whatever it might be. And for some folks, when you redefine your place in the world, you might define it as one of vulnerability, or you might define it as one of strength. And not that one's better than the other, but they are different ways of going forward. And so what we want to think about is how can we encourage folks or promote the likelihood that they end up on a specific path. I think for the treatment providers in the room, having folks confront traumatic events in therapy can also lead to this, right? Shifting your thinking around who you are, why this occurred, and what it means for you can facilitate this process. And we're going to talk about some specific strategies to do that. Yes, sir.
I was going to leave this to the end, but I think it applies to this slide. I don't know if it's Tedeschi and Calhoun that worked with the Army and came up with a theory that catastrophizing in childhood up to trauma was a greater predictor in PTSD. But I also wonder, my theory is that internal locus of control versus external locus of control can also be a predictor on if they go down this path or the other.
Yeah, we're actually going to get to that in a couple of slides, so hang with me, and when we get there, remind me if I don't point back at you and talk a little bit more about that. So, the next question we need to address is who right? Who's likely to experience post-traumatic growth? Again, not everybody who goes through a traumatic event is going to end up on any one of these specific paths. But we know that a large portion will experience some degree of post-traumatic growth. It may not be, the folks that get highlighted, like creative vets or whatever it might be, but to have some degree of post-traumatic growth. And so when we look at what are the characteristics of those individuals that experience that, oftentimes we see women experiencing it at higher rates than men. We see adults at the time of the trauma, right? So children who are exposed to traumatic events are likely going to have a more, I would say, shattered or catastrophic worldview over a longer period of time than somebody who's had 20, 25, 50 years to develop a frame of how the world works and then try and make that trauma make sense, okay? Versus somebody who's 5 or 10 or whatever it might be. And then personality, right? Personality traits of openness and openness to new experiences and openness to risk-taking tend to accept, like, hey, there's some negative consequences that might happen if I, tie this bungee cord around my legs and jump off this bridge, right? They may also be the folks that are more willing to say, hey, there were some risks with that deployment or with these other things that happen that I can now fit back in, and it doesn't mean anything about me. It means that was a dangerous thing that I was, I had to do. Extroverts as well, right? Why do we think extroverts might be more likely to experience post-traumatic growth?
Openness and willingness to communicate.
Yeah,
Extrovert.
a willingness to share and talk about it and communicate and receive information as well.
Less self-isolation.
Less self-isolation, right? You're getting out there, and all of those shifts in how you think about the world, you're now bouncing off of somebody else. And you're getting feedback, right? Is that valid? Is it not valid? Yeah.
The ability to be more vulnerable just because they don't have the social anxiety that comes along with that.
Yeah, so maybe extroverts are more willing to take those social risks, put themselves out there, express vulnerability, whereas somebody who's introverted may say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick at home and not talk about this, right? So yeah, you guys are absolutely right. Okay. So back to your point, that locus of control, and if folks aren't familiar with that term, we talked about internal versus external locus of control. That's sort of the attribution that you make about what causes things. Is it internal? Is it something within me that caused this? Or is it external? Is it something from the environment around me that caused this? And some folks, and it depends on whatever you're talking about, will have a more internal or external locus of control. And so maybe with post-traumatic growth, you're sort of moving more towards an external locus of control where you see that as something outside of yourself. You didn't have a choice, it was going to happen, versus something that you caused or you did or you were responsible for. Okay. How is post-traumatic growth different from resilience? And we talked earlier about one of the arguments against post-traumatic growth is that maybe it's just resilience on steroids, right? I would argue that they're a little bit of a different concept. Resilience is kind of like these palm trees here in the storm are going to bend, and eventually when the storm subsides, come back to standing upright, right? It's your ability to flex and not be damaged, right? Whereas with post-traumatic growth, you've been damaged. The trauma occurred, it happened, right? But what happened after it? Did something new grow? Or did you wither away and not experience that? That's kind of that stump there with the new sapling growing out of it. Okay, so I do think we're talking about two different things when we talk about resilience versus post-traumatic growth. I almost pulled this slide because of how it relates to current events in the world, but I think it's an important story to share. This is the story of Kay Wilson, and this was detailed in the American Psychological Association's monitor letter that they send out routinely back in 2016. And this is the story of post-traumatic growth, and there are some graphic details here, so I can caution you right now. But Kay Wilson is somebody who travels the world and talks about healing from trauma currently, okay? And she talks about her own traumatic event. And her event was, she was in Jerusalem, she was walking through a forest and attacked by some terrorists. And she experienced what we would call dissociation, right? She went to creating a piano arrangement for the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow while this horrific attack was occurring. And she was essentially left for dead and somehow made her way out back and got help. She was 46 at the time and nearly died. And I won't go into the details, you can read it here if you want. But as she talks about that recovery process, which was a long, slow physical recovery, right? She talks about how she healed not only from the physical wounds, but the emotional wounds that she was given. And she now goes around and she speaks to audiences about her survival and how she was able to dispel hatred for whatever group, you know, in this case, it was towards the folks that attacked her. But, you know, in this case, regardless of whether they're Arabs or Jews, forgiveness and healing and personal strength and personal growth, right? And kind of the slogan or the take home for many folks from her talks are, hey, this perspective, you may not agree with it, right? It may be just me, but it helps me make meaning out of something that's so senseless, okay? And that idea of making meaning is going to be really, really important. And as we talk about how do you foster post-traumatic growth within those that you might be working with as a peer or as a counselor, that idea of making meaning is going to be essential. So again, these are those 5 areas that we think are really important to post-traumatic growth. Oh, question.
It's more of a comment, actually. So I think it might be helpful to use post-traumatic growth to identify post-traumatic stress disorder in people that are suffering from it, but don't know what they're suffering from, possibly. Because I know that when I went through my trauma, I just believed that the world is a hard place and it's okay, hard things happen to be good people all the time. And I made it positive, but I saw myself going crazy. And I asked for help when I was in the military, but I didn't know what was going on. But like, I'm a positive person, I like people, and I was able to try to navigate this new world that I lived in, but I was asking for help and not being able to address like what actually happened, and that it wasn't okay what happened, and that it wasn't my fault. And so I feel like there's a lot of us that are trying really hard to do the best that we can after going through trauma, and then we don't get help when we need it with community that we need. And so maybe post-traumatic growth could be a sign that someone has gone through something terribly tragic.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, right? That oftentimes when somebody is dealing with post-traumatic stress, it doesn't get recognized. Folks think, oh, just give us some time, or try this and you know, take these steps, and we don't really give it the gravitas that it needs for healing. But if we look to those who have started that growth process and we see that happening, which might stand out a little bit, right? Maybe we then inquire about, because again, these things aren't one or the other, you could be having both. Maybe you inquire about, hey, what else do you need? How else can we help you? Yeah.
I think it's also important to recognize too that, you know, PTSD, post-traumatic growth, all of these terms and these ideas that we have are very new. And a lot of times, yes, we don't ask for help with PTSD, but also because we don't know what it is, you know. And in my own experience, I didn't know I had PTSD for years until a lot of this stuff has been coming out and awareness around it. So it's important to recognize that we have to know that some of this is new, you know, and not get discouraged because we don't have the answers yet, but also that's fuel for us to find out more about this.
Yeah, our sort of human tendency to try and categorize things and put labels on it is very new. I mean, we're talking about the mid-90s.
Yeah.
if we're being honest, right? Maybe a little bit before that, but certainly at that time we started talking about what this is and how to treat it. And that is still very, very recent. And within this community, we talk about these things and we kind of have heard this before, we know the language. But if you step outside of this conference and try to talk with folks about what post-traumatic stress is, or post-traumatic growth even more, you're not gonna have a good understanding of that. And so it is a challenge because folks don't know that label.
Well, and I think that's where each and every one of us in this room comes in, is to, be comfortable using this language and explaining what we do know and sharing it, because that's how we ultimately spread awareness,
Yeah, absolutely. Couple more hands. Whoever wants to go first.
I just kind of wanted to caveat on what Kristen said. I was kind of thinking during the earlier part of the presentation, like, this all sounds really lovely, and it's great that some of us can dig deep and find the strength to kind of do this, but on the opposite side of the coin, it almost seems like a more dangerous way to deal with, they tell us our entire lives not to repress our feelings, that we should communicate and we should really face what's going on. In your opinion, do you feel like there could also be a negative side of the coin?
Yeah, so I guess I would answer that by saying the idea that there are these different paths afterwards are not the result of a choice that an individual makes, right? They're not choosing to dig deeper than the person next to them, and that's what got them to this positive place versus not, okay? These are the consequences of our biology, our social environment, our history, and the world that we're in, right? And so it's not a choice. Now, for those who do experience this, are there risks involved? Yeah, absolutely. There are, and the biggest risk is, somebody starting down this path and getting negative feedback that then just confirms all of those sort of problematic beliefs that they had about the world that impair their functioning, right? And so it like everything else, it's sort of a gamble or a bet in some cases of, where do I want to put my time and resources and energy? Do I want to protect myself and shield myself and not take those risks, knowing that it's unlikely I'm going to experience the positive effects of that, but it's also not as likely I'll stumble and fall? Or do I want to step out and take that chance and be okay with whatever happens, right? And so it is, you're right, there's a way that it could go bad for folks as well. Yeah.
I'm having a hard time grasping the childhood trauma, and the reason why is on several factors. I actually worked in a mental health a dual diagnosis treatment center before I was deployed in infantry soldier for 15 years. During the time where I had separation and went from active to guard to pursue my civilian career, the reason why I have an issue with the childhood thing is it's more Western centric than actual understanding in a broad sense of community norms or social norms in other countries. When I was deployed over in Iraq, it's like with everything that was happening, it was normal life for the children that were used to it. They don't know any better, or basically don't know anything else besides that environment. But you're saying that if you have childhood trauma at home, you're more susceptible to PTSD. But if you take someone that is in the war-torn country, where firefighting happens, 365 times in a day, it's like that kind of dissipates the model or what you're basically stating, because you really don't know where the person came from, either first generation or not, and then when they go into the military, there's that issue. Well, the other thing too is society as a whole here ostracize anyone with a mental illness because they fear that they will catch it. And a good example of that, when you're in the elevator, if you're having a disagreement with your friend, just calmly say, have you took your medication, and watch your response in the elevator. Everyone will separate because they're fearful of it. But with, you brought up COVID, which is a good example. COVID, that was the first time, now we're dealing with everyone that's coming to us for help. who could not say goodbye, has issues with closure, suffered greatly. And they actually experienced some of what soldiers deployed always experience. Now with PTSD, when you first have it, you start cycling. And it's like in a day you might feel every single emotional range. Then as it increases, you're cycling faster within an hour. And a lot of times we never self-discovery by saying, why do I feel the way I feel? And how has this environment changed? Now, we can never go back to the way we were, because if you take into the fact of Lacar's principle of exchange, you're never going to be the same person like this room. You entered, and you left part of yourself behind, but also you gathered everything around your environment, so you're forever changed. How are you going to deal with those changes? Those are the questions you have to ask. Also, you have to, the most difficult thing with anyone with mental illness, allow them to talk. Don't analyze. Accept them for who they are. Validate their concerns. And the good principles are like EDSP. Validate, for suggest alternatives, and positive prompts. That way, they have a voice. A lot of times in society, veterans get other PTSD because when they're trying to reintegrate back into the communities of their choice, they're ostracized. They're judged differently. They're not tolerated when they're having difficult times. In our current work environments, you have a lot of issues with supervisors and managements being punted towards a vet that has recently transitioned. It's a lot of concepts you have to consider.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to attend to one really important point that you made, and then I'm happy to talk with you more afterwards. But you're absolutely right that we're talking about this from the lens of Western culture and Western society. The DSM is a Western concept, right? Oh, Keith, what'd I do?
You should. Yes. When you ask that question, it automatically comes back up.
The way in which we practice mental health in the US is a Western concept for the most part. There are some Eastern practices that get built in, but we are within a cultural frame. And so when we're talking about this, we're doing so from the culture that we work in. And so there's not, when we talk about those studies with children and trauma survivors of childhood versus adult trauma, those were done in a Western context. It's the kind of ground that those are all based on. So you can't really get away or parse it until you do those cross-cultural studies, which really haven't been done. Yes, one more, and then we've got to get back to
I
that.
was gonna say, I think one of the good aspects, I'm a rec therapist, and actually the people that kind of created this Calhoun rec therapy is their background.
Yep.
And what we're finding is, even with military, putting a PTG, post-traumatic growth, helps say that you can move slowly, move past, or baby steps to getting away from the PTSD stigma of keeping it and cycling it. It's giving hope that you can move past that or grow with it.
Yep.
It's a growth, like you said.
Exactly.
And I think that that's one of the positive aspects, as we know, rec therapy in military is very beneficial, whether it's outdoor, whether it's art, whatever. And that is one of the really neat things about talking about post-traumatic growth. Some of the, TNT and Tunnel to Towers and the Gary Sinise Foundation is actually embracing that same concept and trying to build it in with their program.
This idea that it's a journey, that it's something to continue to work at, and that you never really get to an end point, but it's a constant stride forward. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so who are my clinicians in the room? All right. So the $1 million question here for you all, how do we foster post-traumatic growth, right? This is something we want to cultivate. We want to encourage folks to start taking that journey, to start stepping forward from that traumatic event and all the negative that brought into their life, and maybe finding that meaning and finding those sort of positive aspects for what the rest of their life holds. So how, when we're sitting across from somebody, do we actually do this? Well, there's certain ways, there's certain things we want to do or topics we want to bring up as we're talking with folks about their experience that can help foster that shift that has to happen as we start thinking of post-traumatic growth, right? And so you can see 8 of these sort of ideas here. We're going to talk through them in a little bit more detail. Keith, how are we doing on time?
We have about another 27 minutes.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay. So questions that you can ask when you are working with somebody, or if you're not in that counseling role, if you are wondering about what kind of things can I do on my own, reflect on these questions, right? Have there been new opportunities that emerged as a result of the struggle? What would it mean to find an opportunity? What would you do with that? Okay. What new relationships have I developed as a result of the trauma? And these could be, relationships with a spouse or partner. It could be relationships with your family. It could be a peer-to-peer relationship, right? It could be a relationship between you and your community. But what new relationships have developed as a result of the trauma? And how has that led to empathy or compassion for those who are suffering? How has your view of your own personal strength changed, right? How would you describe that? Right? We have a lot of colloquial sayings about this: no pain, no gain. That which doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? What does that look like in your life? How have you grown as a result of that? How has your appreciation for life in general changed? Did it exist before? Did it not? We heard our keynote earlier talking about sort of his experiences and how that changed his worldview and what sort of things mattered versus what, seemed like they were important but maybe weren't at the end of the day. Do you have a new sense of gratitude? Was there or is there a deepening of one's spiritual life? In what way? Okay. And if the person isn't spiritual or religious, what about just their belief system? Their view of how the world works, did that change? Are there any positive aspects to that could be discussed? And then finally, in facing a new challenge or a trauma or a new difficult situation, would you prefer to be the person that you were before the event or the person after the event? How would you describe that journey? What steps have you taken? And where has it taken you? Okay, this is the grist for that conversational mill to talk about with that individual who's struggling. As they start that process, they start that journey, these can help orient them to thinking about this and talking about those things. And this is not going to be session 1 conversation, right? This is like session 15, right? But these are important conversations to have as part of that treatment process. So let's go through some examples of these. Opportunities. Have new opportunities emerged as a result of the struggle? Have new possibilities opened up that were not present prior to the event? The Paralympic Games are happening right now. Hunter Woodhall, sorry, is a great example of this, right? Somebody who went through something horrific. He's a double amputee, yet he is an amazing sprinter and is competing on a world stage as a Paralympic athlete, okay? There's lots of examples of this. Anybody have one that they can think of and would like to share? Somebody who's been through adversity yet really came out ahead.
Steve Gleason.
Say more. Can you tell us a little bit more about Steve?
Oh, Steve Gleason, from here in this area, football player from Gonzaga Prep and then WSU, and became a Saints football player and is suffering from ALS. Thought he was going to pretty much die and ended up probably being the next person to take AI to a different realm with voice, and he's actually survived and created, there's foundations now here, but it's just that spirit of not giving up family support. Nothing special. He's still living in the New Orleans, and he did after Hurricane Katrina. It was him and a lot of other professional football players that stayed there to try and
Yep.
So yeah,
Exactly,
so
yeah.
Steve Gleason.
So a loss that could have been earth-shattering in his life, right? And was.
Persevered.
Yep, and he persevered. That never give up sort of attitude is exactly what we're talking about. That's a great example.
I don't know if it applies to this slide, another one, but most of us who have deployed and lost friends or had to smell their water. I mean, somebody else talked about this before. All those things you had to do in deployment when you get home, just being able to get a beer is awesome. Being able to have, be with the family is awesome. And it helps, I think, whether you're going PPG or PTSD, if you can see that awesomeness in life where before you haven't had that.
Yeah, that ability to step back and reflect and have some gratitude and appreciation for the little things, right? The ability to just realize, hey, this isn't always available for folks, and I'm going to really treasure the little stuff. Yeah. I see lots of other examples. We're gonna move to some other examples, but I want you to volunteer for those if they still apply. The next one's relationships. Okay. This is a lovely story of World War II soldiers, one from England and one from Germany, that years after the war ended, reconciled and became really, really close friends. And every year they would get together and do a memorial for the buddies that they lost, up until they passed away. And this is one of the more recent photos. They're gone now, but this was them doing that memorial, right? A relationship that you would never think would happen, but they were able to manage that. And it was extremely healing, and there's lots of articles about this for both these gentlemen in their recovery. Any other examples of relationships? Yeah.
I saw this firsthand with my own husband and my grandfather. So my grandfather was World War II. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're
My
fine.
voice doesn't, my children don't. Exactly.
Test, sorry. There you go.
I saw this modeled with my own grandfather versus my husband. My husband lost his platoon and survived it, whereas my grandfather had buddies from World War II that he served with, and up until he died at 92, they would meet for coffee every morning. And as he was the last survivor, I remember him touching the photo in the hallway, and he's just like, I'm the last one that survived, That just brings tears to my eyes. But the relationship that they had through World War II. So it's a strong fortifier. And his livelihood and strength, even though he went through trauma, he had a lot of growth because of those relationships.
Yeah, being able to lean in and lean on those others as you go through a process of struggling and trying to make meaning of it and move forward can really help bolster you and support you where you might feel like sort of in free fall otherwise. Yeah. The next one was personal strength. These are those 5 factors that we talked about, right? So has an individual gained an increased sense of their own personal strength? How would they describe it, right? What sort of perspective taking has allowed them to say, I came out of this a stronger person? This example is one of the victims, the family members of a victim of the Golden State Killer. And if you look at some of the victim statements, you can see elements of post-traumatic growth within those statements, right? Because there was a lot of acceptance and forgiveness, and not in the term of like, it's okay that this happened, but in the term of, I'm going to continue to live my life, regardless of what you did or what you brought into it, okay? What other stories of personal strength have you all found or experienced that are really important to you?
I'm thinking about a presentation I saw in NASWA several years ago. I went to a presentation in NASWA in Washington, D.C., and the guest speaker was Colonel Gadsden, and he's an Iraq Army veteran who stepped on an IED, lost both of his legs, and then rehabbed and insisted on re-enlisting and continuing to serve. And I believe he was a football player, but I'd have to Google it. But his speech was incredibly motivating, from somebody that just had both their legs gone to, speaking to a crowd of like 400 or 500 people and motivating people every day. So, Colonel Gadsden.
Yeah, that strength of no one would fault you if you stopped and gave up at that point, right? Be completely understandable. Yet somehow you found that strength to make something important happen from it and give something to others as a result. I think, yeah, such an important piece of this, and really does exemplify that personal strength characteristic. Gratitude. That's what you were talking about a minute ago, right? Has there been some greater appreciation for life in general that didn't exist before? Some perspective or sense of gratitude that now exists. I'm going to go back to the example of creative vets, because you'll see this as a theme in a lot of the music and art that they produce, is a sense of gratitude and gratefulness and learning, okay? But there's lots of other examples of this. And yours was a great one of like, just the idea of going out and grabbing beer with a friend, right? And not, we take that for granted all the time until you're not able to do that. And all of a sudden you realize, hey, this is what life's all about, right? Any other examples of gratitude that folks can think of? Yes, sir.
A few years ago, I was probably at my lowest point, about 12 years after things happened. So I got the help I needed. And then I've also been diagnosed with early stages of Parkinson's. So on top of PTSD, I got the depression from all that stuff, great stuff. And through the great therapy and some classes, I just realized that, you know what, I do have life. I might have tremors, you might see the tremors, I don't really care now. It is what it is. But I've realized that I'm here for a reason, and it kind of goes back to the spiritual growth too. I was angry at God for a long time. It was my problem, because he never left me. But it took some time, and now I'm here for a reason. Maybe I don't owe it right now, but I'm grateful that I decided to stick around for a little bit longer and help those that I can help and move forward. So the gratitude, and yes, besides the beer, to have a medium over easy eggs, oh yes.
Thank you, sir. Well, I'm glad you're still here too. And thank you for sharing that. And yeah, not only that gratitude piece, but some acceptance, right? Of, I've got dealt a really bad hand. Does that mean I shut down and give up? Or does it mean that I continue with the things that matter to me, despite those, those bad things still happening? Yeah. Spirituality. This is such a personal and deep topic for so many folks that I oftentimes struggle to really give this the attention it deserves. I probably couldn't say it any better than you just did. But Maya Angelou, I think, not only in the quote you see up here at the top, but if you're familiar with her story and the experiences that she went through in her life, and the fact that she came out with a deep, deep sense of spirituality, regardless of one's religious beliefs, I think speaks volumes, and it really exemplifies this. Anybody want to share their experience in this realm as it relates to trauma and growth?
I don't know what I'm gonna say, but
Thank you, Candace.
for me, I'm gonna go ahead and just be really vulnerable and open and honest. I grew up in a very Christian home, and I accepted the Lord as my Savior as a child, 3 years old. I'm a survivor of childhood incest and of MST, and it wasn't so much that I was mad at God, but it was that the people who taught me who God was didn't act who they told me God was. So after the military, about 5 or 6 years after I got out, I hit rock bottom, and I had a grand mal seizure, and that stemmed into a PTSD episode. And that right there told me that I needed to make a change because I was not going to live for very much longer like this. And I found myself in my bathroom one day, and I cried out and I said, Lord, either take my life or I'm taking it. And it was from that moment on, he showed me, like others have said, that he's been along with me every single step of the way. And with that being said, I would never wish my life on somebody else. But I can tell you, if I had a chance to go back and do it again, I would take every bit of hurt that came in my life, because the platform that I have to stand on now and the vulnerability that I get to share with others and to watch others be able to grow through their own spirituality, not necessarily the one that I have, but to find that identity and who they are and get to show the world who they are and not who their trauma has made them to be, is worth every bit of pain that I've been through.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the vulnerability, and that's exactly what this is about. And the ability to share that now just speaks to exactly what you were saying, because a lot of folks wouldn't be able to do that. So thank you. And you stole the show, because I was just gonna put that up here. Now,
thank you for letting me share that with all of you.
no, thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So I oftentimes will show this, and I've had folks come up and say, like, well, what if my answer is different from Candace's? What if I would go back and try to change everything so that I didn't have to go through what I went through? That's valid, absolutely valid, okay? Now, in terms of what path that individual may be on in terms of their recovery following the traumatic event, it may not be one of post-traumatic growth, or maybe they're at one of those points where you're kind of jumping between paths. But as a, in a sense, diagnostic indicator for whether somebody is experiencing post-traumatic growth or not, you may want to ask this question, right? If you could go back and change things, would you? Or would you rather be where you are now, knowing that it took all of those experiences to get you to this point in time, right? Because as you said, you walk into a room, you have a different experience that's going to change the course of your life, regardless of what happens in that room, right? So this is one of those really difficult questions, but can be really meaningful to talk with folks about in terms of identifying what sort of path they're experiencing following their traumatic event. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up a little bit here, I've said it a couple times already, I will repeat it again, that post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, you name it, are not mutually exclusive categories. You can experience multiples of these things, you can experience them at the same time, you can struggle with them while being celebrated for something else, okay? We can jump in between and go back and forth, and it's not a linear process, okay? So you may experience this one day and not the next. That being said, looking back at all the information that was shared from you all, and thinking about what this means to us as a community, I guess it for me, it raises that question of, again, is this our language as we put labels on things like PTSD or post-traumatic growth or moral injury? Is that our just language capacity as humans, or are we truly broken or shattered in some sense? And if your answer is, well, maybe we are broken, I would just ask you if this is broken, right? And saying yes is a valid answer, and saying no is a valid answer for different reasons, okay? But these are the kind of questions we have to ask ourselves as we heal from trauma. Are we irrevocably damaged, or can we repair and become more beautiful as a result of that process? Okay. So again, speaking to my treatment providers in the room, what if the person you're talking to isn't able to find that place of growth? What if they can't get there? That's okay. Okay. A lot of folks aren't able to do that. And a lot of the outcomes that we term success aren't related to post-traumatic growth, okay? When we talk about success, when we're treating things like PTSD, we're talking about symptom remission, okay? We're talking about a return to functioning, being able to carry out our basic duties day to day, to be a part of our family, those sorts of things. They don't really, and they haven't looked at growth as one of those outcomes specifically. And so I don't want folks beating themselves up because that veteran that they saw is just able to get back to work. That's a fantastic outcome. And if we could do that with every single veteran, get back to work, get back to family, whatever, we would be, you know, you'd get a Nobel Prize for that. This is something else that we're talking about, right? Post-traumatic growth is beyond that. We want to be able to return that functioning, but this is something that happens for that individual. And so for the therapist, if you're thinking, how do I have this conversation? How do I cultivate post-traumatic growth? It goes back to those discussion topics that we presented, but also, you know, some tips here. Meet the client in their mindset, okay? You might be ready for them to experience post-traumatic growth. Doesn't mean that they are. That might come later. So meet them where they're at in that moment and nudge them in that direction if you can, okay? Avoid minimizing their suffering. I don't think we have to say any more about that. That's just, you know, that's what we do. Avoid jumping to practical solutions, right? Problem solving is not how you promote post-traumatic growth. That might be how you work on other sorts of outcomes, right? And problem-solving therapy can be very, very, you know, effective in certain things. But when we're talking about producing post-traumatic growth, it's not going to come from a practical solution. It's going to come from the sort of meaning-making and perspective shift that we've been talking about. And so gradually introduce the concept, use their own language, reflect on the insights that they have, ask those questions as a result of that conversation. And by giving voice, when they give you some indication that maybe there is a silver lining here, or maybe I've done something really positive as a result of that, reinforce the heck out of that, because that's going to be the start of that process, okay? Use examples that they've given you, and maybe they're not labeling it as a positive thing, when you from the outside may think, that's huge. Let them know, tell them that, right? And join together in a conversation about that growth process and what that means. Okay. When we think about the treatments that we have for post-traumatic stress disorder, right, there's a lot of different variations of this. Usually they involve, you know, at least two of these components, right? Exposure to address the fear associated with the traumatic memory and situation, and then meaning making about the impact that that event has had on you. Again, lots of different permutations about how you do those two things, but you will find that those two things exist in almost every treatment for PTSD, right? Prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, you name it. So I'm a prolonged exposure guy. That's my background. That's what I've been trained in. And I will tell you that I will sit with somebody and work with them through that exposure component all day long. I love doing that. I think it's important. I think that's what leads to a lot of change in treatment. What I struggle with as a therapist is that meaning-making part, what happens after the exposure. You know, when you are trying to build new associations between the traumatic event and how you're coping with it. And there are some times where you're just stuck, right? Like, I don't know why this happened. There is no reason why you should have experienced that versus not, right? I can't think of a good way to point to a silver lining here, right? And we do it because oftentimes it's not about us being able to give them something. It's about creating space for them to look at in their own thoughts and their own perspectives what that means and the meaning that they make from that event, and helping to engage in that learning process that goes back to the schemas that we showed, the relearning of those sort of mental pathways that are important. Because while we might sit here and say like, hey, yeah, that sounds like a dangerous situation. It sounds like people want to avoid it. Yeah, I don't want you going and doing that again. If we can say, hey, objectively, that's a safe thing to do, and maybe it gets you, some new experience, maybe you need to go do that thing, right? And that's where them trying that out, realizing they can persist through that, they can make something positive happen as part of that sort of practice exercise, can then be the foundation on which that growth builds. Because if I can do that, maybe I can do these other things. Or maybe it means I'm not broken. Maybe it means that I'm stronger now. Okay. Questions? Yes.
So I have a question. It lines up similar.
So if you can just hang on and get the mic from Keith first there.
So a lot of what you have talked about kind of matches depression, but the thing is the start and some of the middle changes, but the outcomes usually lead the same way. And with depression as well, and I don't know the medical field at all, is smiling depression, kind of like Robin Williams, how he was depressed, but he still went out and did a type of growth. Wouldn't you be able to prove this off of depression?
So, I mean, there's a much bigger conversation to be had here in terms of, if you look at the symptoms of depression and PTSD, they're largely the same, with the exception of that traumatic event criteria and some of the hyperarousal situations. But if your question is, could we model the same thing with depression and maybe the recovery from depression? I think yes and no. There are certainly some processes that could facilitate recovery in both. So the idea of behavioral activation, right? Getting out and challenging yourself and taking steps even though you feel like it's not worth it, or it's too much, or you don't have the energy, or with PTSD, it feels too vulnerable or fearful. That process of being willing to do that anyway, I think is key to recovery from both situations. And the mastery that generates, right? The ability to see like, hey, I overcame something, I accomplished something here as a result of that small change I did, I think speaks to that growth piece from both of those. So yeah, we certainly can use that as a model. And I think in trying to move away from the medical model of distinct, diagnoses and categories, and look at how do we promote resilience and wellness and things from a more functional state, it doesn't make a difference, right? We want to do that whenever we see somebody kind of functionally suffering. Yeah.
I think one thing I have a hard time with is like us not looking at the permanency of healing. Like all this growth is healing, you know what I mean? And I think that if we had more of a viewpoint of that healing process as you are healing these layers of suffering and pain and burdens, and we're releasing them. And there's so many ways to do it now, but there's a permanency in that, and the transcendence of it, or the transition of that, that looks like growth, right, is healing. And I feel like that can bring more hope to people if we really looked at it even more, and really brought that to the table, because I know the pain and the suffering can really get our attention and how we're recovering from it. But if we look at what the possibility is and how we can move there, it gives people more hope to get there. I just really felt like I needed to say that, sorry.
Yeah, it's something I talk a lot about with suicide, is that we tend to treat these things as outcomes, and that maybe isn't what we need to do. We need to look at the process.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and that process is where the healing happens, and the process is where that outcome is either achieved or avoided. And if we can shift our focus to what we can do in that process, then maybe we're going to see better results than if we only focus on the outcome.
which is the learning piece, right? We're learning about ourselves, we're learning how we process things, you know, and so when we look at it as a learning, right, and of those layers of process, even if we're avoiding, right, then we're able to recalibrate, right, and like have a different perspective of feeling it. Because we're gonna have the dance, right? We're gonna dance into avoidance, we're gonna dance into, you know, release, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
To go back on a slide that you had about how to overcome, one thing I actually use that I don't know might help others is identify how you're feeling and also analyze your environment. Then you assess the environment of like what stimulates or what's causing me to feel this way. And then you do a threat assessment or what you challenge, like what's the worst situation you ever experienced? Well, being in combat infantry treatment, getting shot at, IEDs, and also mortars. So I take that in perspective and analyze, is this causing a threat to my life? If it isn't, then there's nothing to worry about. And you dismiss the stimuli, and then you condition yourself. A good example, when I first came back from Iraq, my boots were on the ground less than a month, and my sister's like, hey, let's go buy some fireworks. So I went to the muzzle shoot. They started sounding off artillery rounds and mortar rounds. I dropped to the knee and was scanning the area. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, what's wrong? And that was the first time realizing that my environment and the stimuli around me was causing this. So eventually, over a period of time, I'd actually go back during that year, sit there and see how long I could tolerate just being in my car. And pretty soon I was outside my car, and then eventually I challenged the stimuli, which to this day is not so great like before, but it was a method that helped. And I meant to comment earlier on that slide, but I wanted to hear the rest.
No, I appreciate that. You know, and the other, I think, important piece in that is that we gotta be careful not to jump straight to post-traumatic growth, right? There's some healing and natural recovery we need to facilitate right away. That's just the fundamental stuff of what you're talking about, which is like desensitization to innocuous stimuli, right? Once we've achieved that, once that's under control and treatment has been effective in remediating those symptoms, then we can start that conversation about longer term post-traumatic growth and how to facilitate that. But sometimes you have to do the immediate wound care before you can get to the big stuff. Yeah.
I just have a really quick thing to say, and that's mainly towards the clinicians or the people that are treating those of us that struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's mainly like, we're not something to be fixed. Like, we're maybe like, there's no point where you can be like, oh, you're fixed now, you're good to go all by yourself. And so I think that one of the best assets that you can give us as people that have been through traumatic incidents and are trying to do the best that we can is teach us how to speak to our communities about what our needs are so that we can heal within our communities, within our individual communities. Because really it's by being able to tell our stories and showcase who we are and be accepted for who we are on the other side of what we've experienced by our communities and our families that we live within, that we're going to have that longevity of being able to have a sustainable life that's truly successful on every level and not just going back to work.
Thanks. I am, because folks are stepping out, I'll put this up. This is the survey for review. Sir, we have time, so feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick thing, if you need continuing education, that QR code's really important, and then at the last question, you just say, email it here, and then you'll get your certificate. Yeah, please.
I was just gonna say is, with PTSD, I kind of look at it the same way I look with my great Parkinson's. Parkinson's is going to get worse over time, but my PTSD can get better. It's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be solved because it's just part of me, but I think I can work with the symptoms to get better with it. And then, like I said, I got the other fun things, so I'll just deal with that when it comes. So, thanks.
No, thank you. And before we let's give Larry Pruitt, Dr. Pruitt, a huge hand. What a great topic. What an incredible presentation. And if you want to, I just want to make sure we acknowledge your.
Thank you. Thank you.